All right, going back to the main part of the book. Cyrus, of whom marched upon the gates of Babylon and destroyed that nation forever with only a single night of flawless victory, just as Babylon was promised to fall to a conquering army in chapter 13 and 14 of Isaiah. Now let's go to Isaiah 13, 4 through 5. The noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people. A tremulous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together, the Persians and the Medes. The Lord of hosts musters the host of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord, and the weapon of his indignation, to destroy the whole land, to destroy Babylon, that once was, for it was going to be no more. In fact, in speaking of the gates of the city of Babylon, and of how history informs us that they were accidentally opened up by Babylon's own servants, their own soldiers, we see this verse as a mere coincidence. Isaiah 45:2. I will go before you, Cyrus, in the battle against Babylon, make the crooked places straight, clear the path for him to proceed in this flawless victory, and I'm going to break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. Now, through this reading, we stumbled upon two explanatory notes here, which the first one was, history informs us that they were accidentally opened up the gates by Babylon's own servants and soldiers. It's not only seen in our explanatory note from commentator Albert Barnes, of which note was entitled A Single Night of Flawless Victory, read that just a moment ago, and who in turn was quoting the ancient writer Xenophon from 370 BC, we can also consider the following quote from John Gill, who also quotes Xenophon. So let's go to John Gill's exposition of the Bible. Belshazzar was slain by Galidus and Grobrius. You remember those two men who were appointed like captains or generals or whatever for Cyrus? These were actually deserters of Babylon. They went to Cyrus and told him that they helped them get them in. So it was probably their idea about going through the river Euphrates underneath the city. So anyway, Belshazzar was slain by those two men who were deserters of Babylon, who led Cyrus's army up the river Euphrates into the city of Babylon. Okay, I was right. Its course being turned, the inhabitants of which being reveling and rioting, and the gates were open. These men went up to the king's palace, the doors of which were opened by the king's orders to know what was going on. What's the matter? They rushed in, finding him standing up with a sword drawn in his own defense. They fell upon him and slew him, and all about him, all the people about him, as Xenophon relates. And this was the same night the feast was, and the handwriting was seen, read, and interpreted, as we see Daniel do in Daniel chapter 5. This was after a reign of 17 years of Belshazzar. For Josephus says that Baltasar, or Belshazzar, in whose reign Babylon was taken, reigned 17 years. Now, the next explanatory note is called, I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. Let's go to John Gill once again. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron, with which the brazen gates were barred. In the wall that surrounded Babylon, there were 100 gates. Can you imagine that? All made of solid brass, 25 on each side of the square, which no doubt are here referred to in Isaiah 45:2, which could not hinder the entrance of Cyrus into the city or of the taking of it. Okay, back to the main part of the book. So it was not too difficult for the joined forces of the Medes and the Persians to enter thereto and storm the palace of the Babylonian king, who at that time was Belshazzar, grandson of the great Nebuchadnezzar, whom the Bible instead claims was Nebuchadnezzar's son. Let's go to Daniel 5:2. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. And then Daniel 5:11b. Nebuchadnezzar, your Belshazzar's father, the king. But as archaeology and well-deciphered history explains, it was his father in the same way that David was a father to all his descendants. Let's look at Matthew 120b for reference. Behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him, Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not, and take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. And then in Matthew 9:27, when Jesus departed thence, two blind men followed him, crying and saying, Thou son of David, have mercy on us, and etc. That is, in picking a great man to name as the father of his descendants. So in that case, the Bible made no mistake in calling Nebuchadnezzar Belshazzar's father, even though technically he was his grandson. Now let's go to an explanatory note. As archaeology and well-deciphered history explains. Let's go to Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary. His father, Nebuchadnezzar, that is his forefather. So similar to Jesus being the son of David, the son of Abraham, as we see in Matthew 1. Daniel does not say that the other kings mentioned in other writers did not reign between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, namely evil Marduk, Jeremiah 52:31. Now here we go with these names. Nebuchadnezzar, his brother-in-law, and labor. Look at it on the screen. For 9 months. Berosus makes now this is a name that has to be remembered here. Nebuchadnezzar, the last king to have been one of the people raised to the throne by an insurrection. As the inscriptions show that Belshazzar was distinct from and joint king with, i.e., Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadnezzar, was his actual father. Belshazzar's dad was this Nebuchadnezzar, however you want to pronounce it. This is not at variance with Daniel. This doesn't contradict Daniel, whose statement that Belshazzar was his son, that is grandson, of Nebuchadnezzar is corroborated by Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 27:7, we see this. And all nations shall serve him, Nebuchadnezzar, see verse 6 of that chapter, and his son, Nebuchadnezzar, and his son's son, Belshazzar, until the very time of his land come, and then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of him. Their joint yet independent testimony as contemporaries, again father and son, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and having the best means of information, is more trustworthy than any of the heathen historians, if there were a discrepancy. Evil Marduk, whom some equate with being Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nebuchadnezzar, according to Berosus, reigned but a short time, 1 or 2 years, having in consequence of his bad government been dethroned by a plot of Nebuchadnezzar, his sister's husband. Hence Daniel does not even mention it. At the elevation of Nebuchadnezzar as supreme king, Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, was doubtless suffered to be subordinate king and successor, in order to conciliate the legitimate party. Thus the seeming discrepancy becomes a confirmation of genuineness when cleared up, for the real harmony must have been undesigned. Now, let's go to Eason's Bible Dictionary. The absence of the name of Belshazzar on the monuments was long regarded as an argument against the genuineness of the book of Daniel. In 1854, Sir Henry Rawlinson found an inscription of Nebuchadnezzar, which referred to his eldest son, Belshazzar. Quite recently, however, the site of a ravine undermined by heavy rainfalls at Keilah, a suburb of Babylon, and a number of huge, coarse earthenware vases were laid bare. These were filled with tablets, the receipts and contracts of a firm of Babylonian bankers, which show that Belshazzar had a household with secretaries and stewards. One was dated in the 3rd year of the king Marduk-Sar-Azor. As Marduk-Sar-Azor was another name for Baal, this Marduk-Sar-Azor was found to be the Belshazzar of Scripture. And finally, Fawcett's Bible Dictionary says this. The inscription at Umquhar, that is Ur of the Chaldees, read by Sir H. Rawlinson, strews that Nebuchadnezzar admitted his son Belshazzar into the share of his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar, defeated by Cyrus in the field, fled to Borsippa and survived. But Belshazzar fell in the last assault of Babylon. Xenophon calls the last king of Babylon impious and illustrates his cruelty by the fact that he killed a courtier. This is talking about Belshazzar. He killed a courtier for having struck down the game and hunting before he did. And he had unmanned Gatius, a courtier, at a banquet because one of the king's courtiers praised him as handsome. Okay. Now, even though I also believe in fulfillments of many of Isaiah's words in futuristic events, I cannot say that we should see these things spoken of by Isaiah concerning Babylon's fate and of Lucifer's involvement in being its king for our own times, as opposed to them being fulfilled within an Old Testament setting, especially when the Bible actually named the man, again Cyrus, and even in the same book, Isaiah, who just so happened to have ended the reign of the natural Babylonian kings by its conquering. Not only so, but he, as was promised, had set the Israeli captives free. Are we to believe, therefore, that by Isaiah naming the actual man who would do this futuristic event to be only a coincidence? Now let's compare these two verses. Isaiah 14:1a says, and this is just before speaking on Lucifer in verse 4, and of actually calling him Lucifer in verse 12. For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land. Isaiah 45:4a. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect, I have called you, Cyrus, by your name. To do what? Again, to set them at liberty from Babylonian rule. Isaiah 14:3. It shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give you, the Israelites, rest from your sorrow, and from your fear, and from the hard bondage wherein you was made to serve. To serve whom? Again, the kings of Babylon, for so does the passage continue. In Isaiah 14:4-8. That you shall take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. Now remember, take up this proverb, take up this parable, take up this metaphor. So we don't have to read this literally. This is a metaphoric message to the king of Babylon. That you should take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, Lucifer, and say, how has the oppressor ceased? See, your oppressions against nations, and especially the Israelites, they're over. They ceased. The golden city has ceased. The city of Babylon's no more. Why? Because Cyrus marches to your gates for its utter destruction. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. Babylonian rulers are no more. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger, is persecuted, and none will hinder it. The whole earth is at rest now, and it's quiet. They break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at you, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you are laid down, no feller has come up against us. And just who is this king of Babylon who is at fault? And who is the king who will fall? Let's continue. Isaiah 14:12-17. How are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How are you cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I'm going to exalt my throne above the stars of God. I'm going to sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I'm going to be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see you shall narrowly look upon you and consider you, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble? So it's not a supernatural being here. Who did shake the kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners? Is that the man? Are we actually switching gears here Now going from an actual prophecy against the wicked nation and kings of Babylon, historically speaking, and are we now talking about a very spiritual matter concerning either the devil or first man Adam? No. We're continue to speak against that wicked nation and that wicked Babylonian king. But which king? What king? King Lucifer? Could Lucifer actually have been his real actual name? Do remember how I spoke on this matter in the last chapter. As we plod along, as I continue building my case, I'm actually seeing Lucifer more as a title given exclusively by God to the man rather than being his actual name. And not only, but it seems to be becoming more and more obvious that this king was either Nebuchadnezzar or was his grandson Belshazzar, as we had actually seen named by past commentators in our last chapter, or perhaps, and more to the point, it was a combination of both of these two men put together. That is, being the kingship in general of Babylon, and as such oppressors, their kings of that same family.